Hello, and welcome to the critical move of Telesur. The expansion of the novel coronavirus pandemic in the indigenous communities of the Amazon, together with another resurgence, the forest fires, places the native peoples in that area of the American continent in serious danger. What factors come into play? What state policies are applied in this vast area? What geostrategic interests prevail in this zone? Let's deploy the board. We're making the first move. A virtual meeting organized by Colombia and Peru took place 1 year after the signing of the Leticia Pact by the Amazon countries, which established measures to preserve the tropical forest. The meeting was attended by presidents of Colombia, Iván Duque, from Peru, Martín Vizcarra, from Bolivia, Janine Áñez, and from Ecuador, Lenin Moreno, as well as the ambassadors of Guyana and Suriname. But it was the president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, the main discordant note. Let's see why. In July of this year, compared to July of last year, we recorded a 28% decrease in deforestation of fires in the region. But we are still criticized. After all, Brazil is a powerhouse in agribusiness. Threats exist above us all the time, and unfortunately, some Brazilians work against us on the issue. Since it's a rainforest, like much of yours, it does not burn. So that story about the Amazon burning with fire is a lie. And we must fight it with real numbers. And that's what we are doing here in Brazil. Our policy is one of zero tolerance, not only for common crime, but also for environmental issues. The fight against illicit activities is fundamental for the preservation of our Amazon. But that's not all. We must also promote sustainable development in the region. We have more than 20 million Brazilians in this area. We cannot forget them. In Brazil alone, we have demarcated as indigenous lands more than 14% of our national territory, the world that wants to see us without the Amazon. My government intended to reach 20%. That would make our entire economy unviable, in large part through agro-industry. Today, we are more aware than ever that even in the midst of the pandemic, our commitment to protect this heritage of our environmental sovereignty, but which has a fundamental role for the world, is more alive than ever. The fight against drug trafficking, the fight against the illegal extraction of minerals, and fight against the illegal development of deforestation projects for timber trafficking, also the fight against species trafficking, the integration of the ancestral communities of indigenous peoples in what corresponds to the development of a bioeconomy, where we want to link them in a sustainable way to productive schemes also associated with conservation. On August 10th and 11th last year, a political act was articulated through a group of social networks to burn both grasslands and forest areas to demonstrate their approval of the anti-environmentalist policies that the government was implementing in Brazil. In the areas we flew over in July of this year and which were burned last year, we could see that there were already pastures with animals, with fattening cattle to be commercialized. The fire is now out of control. We're trying to save the animals, save the houses. What's the most important thing right now? Nature. Look at this. Everything is turning into coal and smoke. This year's fires are among the most devastating in 20 years. The Delta is on fire. We need the authorities to the three provinces of entire Rios, Santa Fe, and Buenos Aires, and the national state to take action, to really develop an urgent, clear policy to stop this devastation. It's the most important wetland system in Argentina. We say here that it is our little Amazon. It is a highly valuable ecosystem of great biodiversity and richness. We've been treating all the symptoms. We've been feeling with home remedies since the time of our ancestors. With a little knowledge, these remedies have been used, and we use them as an experiment to fight diseases. Without any help, I'm doing this job to support our families. Here are people with hypertension, diabetes, who can't go to basic health units. Let's map out the geographic area that is currently under our attention today. Amazon, vegetal long under siege by capitalism. The Amazon is the largest tropical forest in the world, covering 7.4 million square kilometers, equivalent to 5% of the Earth's surface and almost 25% of the American continent. This area is distributed among 9 countries, Brazil and Peru with the majority, followed by decreasing order by Bolivia, Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Guyana, French Guiana, and Suriname. All are members of the Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization, founded in 1995 on the basis of agreements signed in 1978 and denounced as historically inoperative in the face of the problem posed by this geography. The Amazon is located in the central and northern part of South America, encompassing the rainforest of the Amazon River Basin. It's just over half of the total rainforest of our planet. Because of its beauty, imposing and other characteristics, on November 11, 2011, it was declared one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. The Amazon has an extensive variety of fish, birds, reptiles, and mammals, as well as 30,000 species of vascular plants, many with innumerable nutritional and medicinal properties. Recent estimates indicate that the Amazon is inhabited by 34 million people, 60% of which are concentrated in the urban poles. Culturally, it is one of the most diverse regions of the planet. The indigenous peoples are divided into more than 400 tribes, and according to their language, Tupi, Ye, Carib, Arawak, and Pakatan. The Amazon holds no less than 20% of the Earth's fresh water reserves. That wealth is contained above all in the Amazon River, the largest and longest in the world. However, it is estimated that hundreds of tons of mercury used in illegal mining have been dumped into it and its tributaries. The space has been the victim of an expropriation of the land, linked to a strong process of urbanization. This is how they are confronted: the expansion of agro-industry, soy, cattle raising, mining, and the exploitation of wood, with that of conservationists and defended by small producers, environmentalists, and scientists. What has happened regarding forest fires in the Amazon since last year up till now? Let's review. Only 1 year has passed since the devastating fires in the Amazon and the region is once again in flames, according to data from Brazil's National Institute of Special Studies. Last June, the nation's share of the total number of active fires registered at least 2,248, which is 90.6%, more than in 2019, when the institution registered 1,880 fires. The investigative agency reported that in the first 10 days of August, more than 10,000 fires were reported, 17% more than the same period the last years. The entity highlights that the accelerated pace of deforestation might reach to destroy at least 9,000 square kilometers of forest in coming months. Scientists and environmentalists express concern, since June marks the beginning of the dry season in the Amazon. The period extends to October and usually records a greater increase in the number of outbreaks. In addition, illegal burning has increased and affects mainly the areas of environmental and indigenous reserves. President Jair Bolsonaro's permissive policies encourage the so-called religion, a term that in Portuguese describes an ancient practice of aging forged documents to obtain possession of a certain area of land. It has been used to refer to the hoarding of public land and the practice of illegal mining in the region. Following deforestation and the removal of valuable timber, fire also cleans up forest areas and leaves them at the mercy of illegal occupation of protected areas. As with the COVID-19 pandemic, Bolsonaro has denied the increase in fires in the Amazon. He did so during the second presidential summit for the Amazon, held virtually with representatives from Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, Brazil, Guyana, Bolivia, and Suriname. In this context, the current head of the Planalto victimized himself, saying that his government receives numerous unfair criticism from other countries. Journalist Gustavo Faleiros, editor of the portal Info Amazonia and specialist in satellite monitoring for environmental purposes, through his Twitter account quoted the words of Bolsonaro and added the satellite image of NASA, where carbon monoxide emissions can be observed from space in different parts of the Brazilian Amazon. And in the midst of state neglect of the native peoples of the Amazon basin, Venezuela is an honorable exception. Perhaps that is why the authorities of the Bolivarian country were not invited to the virtual summit recently sponsored by Colombia and Peru, along with other nations. Let's see what it titles Venezuelan TV. Indigenous Movement of Venezuela denies neglect of indigenous communities facing COVID-19. In a statement, the United Indigenous Movement of Venezuela categorically denied that Native communities are being neglected by the national government in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is in reference to the expressions made by the Deputy of the National Assembly and the Amazonian Parliament, Larissa Gonzalez, who supported a communique from civil organization of the Waro people who supposedly state that they lacked resources to confront COVID-19. The communique was published by the Minister of People's Power for Indigenous Peoples, Aloya Núñez, on her Twitter account, in which she expressed her discontent that organizations that do not live in the ancestral territory of the Warao people are attempting from abroad to make arbitrary statements on behalf of a people who have autonomy and the determination to defend their communities. Likewise, the United Indigenous Movement of Venezuela repudiated these assertions made without any foundation whatsoever, only mere assumptions made in a malicious and unscrupulous manner in order to distort the reality of their indigenous communities for petty and selfish purposes without taking into account the opinion of those who inhabit this ancestral territory. The situation in other Amazon countries is diametrically opposed. Let's see how our house Telesur titled an article published on July 29. UN calls for solidarity for indigenous communities in the Amazon. The local offices of the United Nations in Colombia, Brazil, and Peru, through a joint communique, made an urgent call for international solidarity in order to obtain more funds and to respond to the expansion of the COVID-19 in the indigenous communities of the Amazon basin. The news comes after indigenous organizations in each of these countries have denounced separately and on several occasions what they consider a genocide against their communities, in view of the insufficient attention paid by central governments to these communities, in which some 170,000 people live. Incidents and fatality rates in Amazonian Aboriginal communities are significantly higher than national average, which led the UN to state that, despite the efforts of the three governments to respond to the crisis, there are growing concerns about the capacity of health institutions to cope and save lives. The UN explained that at the same time that the spread of COVID-19 is being mitigated by measures such as isolation, there are severe socioeconomic consequences for the area, expressed in the deepening of gender inequalities, food security risk, or precarious nutritional status in communities that were already in vulnerable conditions. According to indigenous organizations in Colombia, out of 63 native peoples, some 3,030 people have been diagnosed and 114 have died. In Brazil, out of 145 people, 19,773 people have been infected and 590 have died, while in Peru, out of 55 Amazonian peoples, some 8,405 were COVID-19 positive and 45 people died. I'd like to suggest you the reading of an article published by Brazil De Facto on August 11 entitled Agribusiness and Coronavirus, a link beyond all suspicion by Nachar Tubino. The destruction of the environment for the production of items such as meat and soy releases unknown viruses and diseases. Agro-industry is not pop, as the official announcement of the largest open television channel says. The world's agro-industry consumes 2.3 billion kilos of pesticides, that is poison, and 80% of the 1.5 billion hectares of land on the planet. In 2018, 12 million hectares of tropical forests were replaced by soybeans, oil palms, or cattle pastures. Brazil and Indonesia, the largest producers of palm oil, accounted for 46% of the deforestation. Land use, says the Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, based in Bonn, Germany, report now appears to be the main factor in the collapse of biodiversity. Other factors: hunting, direct exploitation of animals, climate change, pollution, and invasive species. Tropical forests are not the only ecosystems in danger, but they are the richest and most intricate structure, explains science journalist David Quammen. Millions of types of creatures live there, most of which are unknown to science, which has not yet classified them as species, and we know very little about them. Among these millions of unknown creatures are viruses, bacteria, fungus, protists, and other organisms, many of which are parasites. Is the next great pandemic caused by a virus? Will it come from a rainforest of remarking in southern China? We harass, expel, exterminate, and eat wild species and are contracting their diseases. The point is, they want to return to the normality of sclerotic capitalism. You will have to start producing real food and totally change the production system of agribusinesses. Let's update more information with our correspondent Nacho Lemus from Sao Paulo, Brazil. Greetings. Fires in the Brazilian Amazon have increased by 30% during the month of July in relation to the same period last year, a year that has already put the eyes on the whole planet on the advance of the fires in the Brazilian Amazon, for the extension of the agropecuarian and mining frontier, and also on the property interests. President Jair Bolsonaro, in this week's meeting by video conference with the presidents of Amazon countries, has said that this is a lie and that he would fight these lies in relation to the advance of the fires and deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon, something that was instantly refuted by NASA's own satellite, which shows in real time, as the president speaks, how a few wave of fires is occurring in the Brazilian Amazon, that we are precisely in August, the period in which this activist sector starts the fires, and also a period of dryness in Brazil. Another sector affected in the Brazilian marshland, at this time by these fires for the extension of the border under commercial interests. On the other hand, there has been a 33% growth, according to data from the National Institute of Space Research, a Brazilian organization in relation to deforestation in Brazil, during the administration of President Jair Bolsonaro, which he took office in January 2019. Then, a context of extension of the border for extractive interests, and on the other hand, the prejudice that this brings to the indigenous populations that have denounced that the Brazilian president seeks to carry out ethnic cleansing to give rise to the advance of these commercial sectors on indigenous lands, which are found as a barrier in the protection of native vegetation in Brazil. Nacho, thank you very much for this report. Let's take our first break in a critical move. Remember, there is a strategic move in social media for you to participate with us. In addition to the incendiary devastation suffered by the native peoples of the Amazon, the health crisis caused by COVID-19 has now been added. Why, except in Venezuela, is the preventive action of governments not visible? Silent extermination in sight? Leave your opinion. Let's take a short break. The Amazon basin is on alert for the spread of the novel coronavirus pandemic, which by the beginning of this month exceeded 34,000 positive cases. Let's review. Despite covering areas with little contact with international travelers and difficult access to this area, the spread of the novel coronavirus has had a strong impact on the indigenous community in the Amazon. The indigenous peoples and the hospitals where some of them live do not have resources such as masks, face, tests to detect the virus, alcohol solutions, and, in the case of the sick ones, oxygen balloons and medicines. For that reason, many of them take refuge in traditional medicine. The indigenous organizations in the different countries express the need to be heard by the state authorities. There are about 500 indigenous peoples living in the Amazon basin, 76 of which have assumed voluntary isolation. One of the worst countries is Brazil, epicenter of the pandemic in South America and second most affected in the world. In its territory live about 380 peoples, and until last July, more than 15,000 of its members have been infected with the disease. Of the more than 3 million infections and 101,000 deaths registered in the nation by the Johns Hopkins University. On August 5, the spiritual leader Aritania Wajawalapiti, one of the main defenders of the Amazon, died after being hospitalized for 15 days due to health complications. The news highlights the vulnerability of the Amazonian people to the health emergency. The Pan-Amazonian Search Network and the coordinator of indigenous organizations of the Amazon Basin have registered 34,598 cases of indigenous people infected with COVID-19. In addition, 1,251 deaths have been registered. In many of these Brazilian communities affected by the spread of the pandemic, medical attention is not existent, especially after the departure of the Cuban mission, more doctors, by decision of President Jair Bolsonaro. This way we start the analysis in our critical move. We have from Brazil, Armando de Negri, coordinator of the Executive Committee of the World Social Forum on Health and Social Security, and from Peru, Héctor Bellar, lawyer and sociologist, professor at the University of San Marcos. Welcome both of you to our critical move. Armando, I'll start with you, if Professor Bellar allows me. How can we understand that being geographically distant and apart, these indigenous communities in the Amazon basin are also victims of the COVID-19? We have tried to make an approach to this problem through this material, but I want you, as a specialist, to explain us a little more about this. Well, first of all, we need to say that the dynamic of the epidemic in Brazil has had a lot of different current aspects. The epidemic enters for the southern biggest cities through travelers that came especially from Europe and started in the center of the more richest neighborhoods and then started to spread slowly to the inner part of the country. And the epicenter has been seen especially from the capitals and also from people who came from abroad. Do you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. And especially they arrived to capitals such as Manaus, Pacapá, and Amapá state, and then they started to spread the virus to other inner spaces, reaching the smallest towns step by step, and also to other people who live alongside the Amazon rivers, in these areas where this population, with these native populations are. And this population of people who are African descendant, those ones who settled in the hardest parts where access is not so easy. And despite the distance, and despite that maybe there is not a right immediate contact with these people who came from abroad, the progressive installation and the circulation of the virus is given in a way that interchange between these regions and the capitals by economical interchange and some other services. For instance, in the particular cases of indigenous populations, they have made some sort of denouncements because of contentions that also was brought in through medical staff, doctors and nurses who came into these areas, and they were carrying the virus without any symptoms. But the virus started to circulate, so these indigenous in their own villages. And as it was pointed out, the distant issue on this infrastructure from the health point of view, this allows also the testing, the initial testing, and the orders of isolation. Well, sometimes it's hard to understand because of the cultural situation, but has reached out these communities. But remember, the contact between these health authorities and from the self-responsible structure itself that has been generated from different states, what has made possible that this circulation carried out without bigger cultural barriers. That's why in this moment it's very concerning that these indigenous peoples should keep on counting about the incidence of these indigenous groups throughout the country, not only in the Amazon area, and especially when it comes to the number of dead people and the number of positive cases, which are right now 146 villages that have positive cases. So therefore this circulation has increased since these contacts made for non-indigenous people, but also with indigenous who are communicating between villages, and this has become a very serious problem. And that relation that indigenous people have tried to have another protective procedures and measures, and also reivindication movements to provide adequate conditions and measures to protect themselves by the side of a special secretary. We need to remember that a very serious problem that happened, it was when the interruption of the program, more doctors, which were mostly Cuban doctors, when President Jair Bolsonaro canceled this program, and this particularly leave a lot of unprotected spaces, especially on the indigenous sectors, in those poor areas, these campesinos areas. And this place that it was located in this area and in a permanent way. So this has been a factor that has increased to not to be able to face these more dramatic circumstances in this pandemic. Thank you so much. Then we add Professor Hector to our dialogue. Professor Hector, welcome to our critical move. I take this moment to reflect with you the situation that is being lived in Peru regarding the coronavirus. In the urbanized Peru, everything seems to indicate that it is not very different from the one in the Amazon area, with these native peoples that also belong to Peru. I also think that has very serious factors, because as we all know, right now, practically in Peru had never existed a health system before. And the health system is in a very, very precarious situation. So this made that Iquitos, which is for us the capital of the Amazon in Peru, has generated practically a horror situation, horror policy, because there were not enough hospitals, there were not enough oxygen for patients, there were not doctors, so people were just dying on the streets until the pandemic, by its all situation, slowed down a bit. But then it moved, it kept on moving until it started to reach the indigenous people, where those people who had such a very bad health system. And we see the Navy ships who eventually sail through the Amazon rivers, providing assistance that, of course, it's not enough. And that makes that indigenous peoples, well, they have a lot of problems upon them. The oil exploitation that generates their waters, and the presence of mafias, which are matroleras mafias, who are in the jungle. And this is the worst season, because it's the dry season. That is precisely the period and the season where all these mafias, they take advantage to deforest, and especially the agriculture, the settlers who try to enter into the jungle. Well, they open up these spaces in the middle of the jungle. So it is very curious, and it's terrible at the same time, because, for instance, if you reach Cusco at this time, which is very far from the jungle, approximately around 500 kilometers, in this place that is called Madre de Dios, well, you can find a lot of big smoke columns, because they cannot reach into Cusco, so they do this. It's a terrible thing. And of course, there is no control of the state, only statements. And the presence of these oil companies, well, this constitutes such a real plague for the population, for the peoples, to which once recently has added the presence of land trafficking closely to Quito, which is the largest city, and they start to cut down trees around it. Well, they are worsening this whole territory. So the current situation is very troubling and very concerning in the Amazon of Peru. Thank you, Professor. I want to stay with you because I know that you know the geography of South America so well. And before we heard the president of Colombia, Ivan Duque. He was saying the fight against drug trafficking, the fight against illegal extraction of minerals, and the fight against illegal development of deforestation projects for wood trafficking. Also the fight against trafficking on species, added to this integration of the ancestral communities of indigenous peoples, which corresponds to the development of a bioeconomy. We want to link them in a sustainable way to productive schemes also associated with conservation. Why do I want to stay with you for a couple more minutes? Because that picture you just described of what is happening in Peru is practically what you see today in Colombia, and it contrasts very much with the words of its president, Ivan Duque. Well, it's the same here. It's the reality. It contrasts with the word of the people who are ruling us right now. And of course, let's say that groups that are ruling Peru, which are located in Lima, as you may understand, Lima and cities such as Ucalpa, Iquitos, Puerto Maldonado, and others, well, there is a huge wall, which is the Andes Hills, which is so much higher, and a few miles away from the center of Lima, and even behind the Palace of Lima, well, you can find such a misery which is overwhelming. How will you not be able to find it in populations that are so far away? And the central government has done anything, any effort to truly reach them with a health policy, and no less with a comprehensive policy, intercultural, that is capable, let's not say not able to integrate, because integration word, the word that President Duque used, it's a word that represents the worst of tradition of capitalist when it comes to the inner communities, because they intend to integrate that is, assimilate the local communities to a culture that is absolutely hideous. But in reality, we would be talking about an intercultural policy of understanding of different cultures that sadly in Peru they're part only of a few speeches, not even official speeches, academic speeches of such as the ones we can find on universities, but are so far away from the reality, where the exploitation of women and children, it's horrible, and social abandonment, cultural, also political as well. So these communities have suffered throughout history. Thank you, Professor. Armando, I also want, I don't want to lose the opportunity to reflect with you about the situation that could be happening in other Amazonian countries, like the case of Ecuador, whose president also participated in this virtual summit, where we said at the beginning of the program, President Jair Bolsonaro was, among so many discordant notes, the greatest one. Well, the issue is that in Brazil, it has the most aggressive wave of environmental destruction, and also the native people that it's developed in the region. Within this historical framework of this cultural and environmental system, in the Brazilian case, during this period of 2 years, let's say 1 year and a half, Bolsonaro's government has seen an accelerated that have directed to the Amazon, to the, let's say, the economical situation of these territories. And let's remember when he pointed out that indigenous people were over huge riches, territories, and why these countries could not enjoy this richness. And also talked about the illegal mining situation and the environmental reserves from the indigenous people. And it was always supported by a speech, the necessity of generate acceleration of the economy to circulate riches against preservation and respect of these ancestral territories and territories of preservation of biodiversity. So Bolsonaro in this meeting that was sponsored by another Amazonian countries, well, it's still, it goes between the cynicism of not assuming that there is a serious situation given by all of these figures, given by these institutes. And in other countries, the same as Indian States and the NASA, but reality has created a dimension, which is a liar dimension that changes the reality. So, and there is a whole project with an economic interest that is directly pointed into this direction. That's why the struggle that goes against genocide, it's a fight against genocide, against population of those ones who live by the rivers. And this process has been organized in a very particular way to denounce the solidarity that allows the protection alternative, and above all to sustain something that historically has been affected in the region. Is a developing alternative that affects the dynamic of the nature, starting from the conjugation from the environmental that allows to confront the reality of these people, and at the same time to preserve the heritage, the collective heritage that represents the forest and the nature. It is a fight against genocide. I want to keep that expression of yours for the reflection that I want to make with other of our guests right after the break. Thank you so much, and thank you, Professor Hector, for your time for our critical move. Hugs for you. See you soon. Let's take another break in a critical move. Remember, there's a strategic move in social media. In addition to the incendiary devastation suffered by the native peoples of the Amazon, the health crisis caused by COVID-19 has now been added. Why, except in Venezuela, is the preventive action of governments not visible? Silent extermination in sight? Stay with us. We'll be back soon. Between fire and pandemic, this is how the people of Amazon are going on. A reflection that I want to extend with Beto Almeida, political analyst and president of the television station Ciudad Libre de Brasilia. He's a faithful friend of Telesur. Beto, it is always a pleasure that you accept our invitation. One of our guests mentioned the following phrase: it is a fight against genocide, the historical struggle of the native peoples, especially those in the Amazon basin. You, who know so well the geography of South America, can tell me that not only they are limited to Brazil, but practically to most of the countries that have a basin in the Amazon. Is it true? Welcome. Thank you, Ray. Thank you for the invitation. Greetings to all the viewers of Telesur. It's such a joy to be here and share this vision with you. Well, that is true. We have a demolition and destruction process of structure of the Amazon and the biodiversity resources in the Amazon, as well as recognizing all the mining riches and oil riches, which are also unknown because they have, let's say, for instance, the miomio, which is one of most valuable and precious minerals, and simply for having one of the greatest mines in the world, Brazil should be one of the richest countries without justifying that not even just one poor people, just one poor person. But what happened is the majority of countries, with exception of other countries who has a state policy of preserving the Amazon, which is the case of Venezuela, that not long ago Bolivia also had and was so precautious about this. But now it's all about total devastation, and this comes because of mining, because of oil companies, or because of these fires, as is happening right now in Pantanal zone, which is a very beautiful zone and has been so through the time. But what happens? It is necessary a state policy. So Brazil's government has a fake speech, because speaks about this nationalism, speaks about supposedly sovereignty of the Amazon, but it's precisely the government which is privatizing, let's say, the Orocook place. It was Bolsonaro's government itself who nationalized it, because it's destroying everything. So it's a fake speech, because reality is that state structure of preservation, of encouraging to plant trees, well, all of this has been devoured by the current government. So it's here to eliminate a secretary in these areas, and this talks much about the demolition from the state to start this devastation process, which we are seeing right now. And as part of that demolition of the state, as you defined it, would that document, sadly famous, exposed by President Bolsonaro, and declaring the Brazilian Amazon as a security zone, even militarizing it, well, there is a very tense discussion around it, because the speech is fake. Because the reality is that there is a total absence of the state and a militarization of the Amazon. This would be very hard, because the government itself, the privatization, this demolition of industry, well, this is also creating higher problems. It's a truly lack of security, of sovereignty of Brazil. So therefore, the government says one thing but puts into practice another completely different. Bolsonaro's government, it's completely loyal to the United States and its interests, and of doing things against Venezuela, for instance, and against other countries. This is an idea that would allow, for instance, through agreements, that Brazilian armed forces, along with U.S. armed forces, to exercise that facilitate a presence that there never was before, a U.S. military presence, as well as it is right now in other countries, but not here. But Bolsonaro, with these policies, he's changing, and it's making these things, allowing a possibility to exercise common military exercises, both from the United States and it's also in agree with the base of Alcantara in Maranhão, and this would also allow an U.S. presence in this region. So all of this is very concerning, very troubling, and we need to pay attention carefully to society. They need to demand a change, of course, of this defense policy, because it's not defense at all. It's only a provocation against a country that it's pacifist, like such as Venezuela, which is doing nothing against Brazil. It's only making cooperations and had good relationships in the past with a government that wasn't anti-democratic. So there was a very good cooperation and positive with Venezuela. Therefore, it intends to create a hostility, to increase the worries and of these aggressive ideas of United States against Venezuela, that it's only used in Brazil as a puppet, right inside the military issue. Well, returning to the particular case of the Brazilian Amazon, what are these peoples condemned to? To a kind of silent extermination, either by fires or by the pandemic? Yes, let's say that, how could we say it? It's a almost perfect tragedy, something very evil, because the past in those indigenous people, I'm talking about more than 300 people, more than 200 languages, and out self-protection. I'm talking not well sufficient, avoiding problems, because they need to go to the nearest towns and cities to buy stuff. So if they organize to go in groups to stay protected, even using the cell phones, using computers to make such a necessary, just, smart and democratic control. But not all the tribes, not all the peoples are like that, because they are very fragile. Health systems of Amazons, they were very supported by the Cuban doctors, but there were never this indigenous population. They have never seen a doctor before, not ever. And the only doctors who got there, the first one to got there, was a Cuban doctor. But Bolsonaro has expelled them, has taken them out of the country. This is a crime against health system. This was just about destroying this only health system, which is all completely public and from the state, and to destroy all these programs such as this one, the program More Doctors, with the presence of Cubans, but also from other countries, but mostly from Cuba. So what the Cuban doctors were doing was so good and so worthily. But now these indigenous people, these communities are totally abandoned. They have no assistance, no health assistance at all, because the health system right now has been dismantled right now. And also there are a lot of high expensive, and what the government tends to is to penalize the most poor communities, the indigenous, the campesinos in general. So those people's most poor people. Well, so in most regions in Brazil are being penalized hardly because they have to face 2019 when they are told we need to wash our hands, and they say, but how can we do that if there is no water in the neighborhood? There is no water, there is no drinkable water. It's something that makes no sense. So why they're not organized with the army, but to analyze and to create a water system to distribute among the population or in other indigenous regions in the Amazon? It's possible because it's the Navy, it's the aircraft, and also the Brazilian military who has presence in the Amazon. So all of them are made by the military. It's like a tradition. It was always like that. But with this policy of destroying to increase and to make more rich the bankers with the trillions of money for nothing. And when these budgets are cut by, we can see the people are being using medical stuff with no anesthesia, in total pain and suffering. But this is very necessary. Most deaths are inevitable. So that is why they are so weakened. And there is such a big... Not long ago, a spiritual leader died, a huge spiritual leader. It was such a big loss because he had such a historical leadership in these peoples, all the indigenous causes. He has such a smart relation with the state, because obviously the indigenous people, they need a relation that it is respectful, that has a cooperation with the state itself. Well, everything seems to indicate that it's not the political will of the Brazilian state in this case, and of other states in the region, to care for and protect our native peoples. Well, a big hug for you. Thank you so much for this time. Thank you, and greetings to all the viewers of Telesur. Thank you so much. Well, let's go to conclusions. As if the exponential growth of fires in the same geographical area, where last year they devastated thousands of hectares, were not enough, the eruption of the pandemic in the Amazon has been a hard blow to the native peoples who live there, the same peoples who have historically confronted governments against their inaction. We still wonder if it is involuntary in the face of the plundering of the forest and its resources. We make the honorable exception of the Venezuelan case, the same ones who refuse to move to other parts because they are not willing to leave behind their traditions, their culture, and their assumed mission of protecting the environment. The same ones that systematically march to the state headquarters to denounce their complicity with the transnationals. The same ones who, in the eyes of the world, are victims of extermination, no longer through gunpowder and arquebus, European colonization style, but through flames and the deadly virus. For today, we close the geopolitical board.